Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Wisdom of Yoga, A Seeker's Guide to Extraordinary Living, by Stephen Cope, narrated by Christopher Grove. There were no formerly heroic times, and there was no formerly pure generation. There is no one here but us chickens, and so it has always been. A people busy and powerful, knowledgeable, ambivalent, important, fearful, and self-aware. A people who scheme, promote, deceive, and conquer, who pray for their loved ones and long to flee misery and skip death. It is a weakening and discoloring idea that rustic people knew God personally once upon a time, or even knew selflessness or courage or literature, but that it is too late for us. In fact, the Absolute is available to everyone in every age. There never was a more holy age than ours, and never a less. Annie Dillard, for the time being. Introduction. Mircea Eliade, one of the greatest students of religion in the 20th century, once declared, "We go to the past only in order to learn about such authentic possibilities of human existence as may be repeatable in the present." This book is an inquiry into one such collection of possibilities, the 3,000-year-old wisdom tradition called yoga. In the chapters that follow, we will direct our gaze backward to the fantastic possibilities for human existence discovered by this wisdom tradition. We will direct our gaze backward to an ancient series of discoveries about the human mind and body so remarkable that even the most sophisticated contemporary neuroscience is still at considerable pains to explain them, though their reality can hardly be denied. We will direct our gaze backward to a dazzling 2,000-year-old treatise on yoga and meditation called the Yoga Sutra, a virtually anonymous tract that is one of the most brilliant pieces of spiritual and psychological writing known to humankind. We will look backward, yes, but as Eliade suggests, we will look back at this tradition only in order to see there the reflection of our own possibilities. We may be surprised to find that the ancient wisdom tradition of yoga speaks vividly, even urgently, to our present needs. I first discovered yoga more than 20 years ago. Like most Americans, I came to it initially as a form of physical exercise. It didn't take me long to appreciate the enormous benefits of yoga postures and breathing exercises, and I found myself drawn into a regular practice that steadily increased my energy, stamina, concentration, resilience, and enjoyment of life. In the early years of my practice, however, I didn't appreciate that these physical practices are only one facet of a vast and extremely sophisticated wisdom tradition. I didn't realize that the yoga postures I was doing at my health club are part of a 3,000-year-old science of extraordinary living that concerns itself with every aspect of human functioning, mental, physical, and spiritual. As I discovered the larger wisdom tradition of yoga, I was intrigued. The practitioners of this science of extraordinary living have lived and thrived on the Indian subcontinent for at least the last 3 millennia. They have concerned themselves with a series of perennial questions that are as challenging today as they were when scantily clad yogis first gathered in the forests and mountains of India. What is an optimal human life? What would it be like to function at the maximum potential of our minds and bodies? For at least 3,000 years, yogis have carried out experiments to investigate these questions. Their bold investigations have led to remarkable discoveries about human perception, attention, cognition, motivation, sensory integration, memory, intuition, and volition. These early yogis found that very few human beings live anywhere near the optimal range of human functioning. At the same time, they demonstrated that almost any of us could do so, with much less effort than we imagine. Surprisingly, extraordinary living does not require more native genius than most of us already have. These yogis, too, have been interested in a second, related series of questions. What are the root sources of human suffering? Can these roots of suffering be cut? Can human beings learn to be happy and at ease in this difficult life? Their answers to this second set of questions have also been surprising, and frankly, for many Westerners, just plain unbelievable. Yogis studied the structure of ordinary human unhappiness and found that the sources of everyday suffering could be entirely extinguished, leading to a kind of freedom we ordinarily think impossible. Yogis have called this liberation. Liberation in this instance means freedom from all the sources of conditioning that bind us to small ways of thinking and being. Liberation means being entirely awake and fully alive. The most comprehensive exposition of the ancient wisdom tradition of yoga comes in the form of a 2,000-year-old treatise called the Yoga Sutra. Although its origins will probably always remain obscure, it is most likely that the Yoga Sutra was written by a sage named Patanjali in about the 2nd century CE. The views and practices described by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutra embody the genius of many centuries of yoga practice and investigation. Some scholars have come to call these views and practices classical yoga, but within the tradition itself they have most often been called Raja Yoga, meaning the royal road of yoga, or the exalted way, or the noble way. The wisdom tradition called Raja Yoga preceded the development of postures and breathing exercises, called Hatha Yoga, by many centuries. In fact, most of the important treatises on Hatha Yoga were not written until the 14th century or later, and almost all of them refer back to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. Most of the greatest adepts of Hatha Yoga have taught that postures and breathing practices should be practiced within the goals and context of the broader wisdom tradition. The Yoga Sutra is a foundation stone of all later yoga practice, though, surprisingly enough for modern readers, this classic treatise involves almost no teaching about yoga postures as we know them. What kind of yoga, then, does Patanjali teach if he does not teach postures? Usually, his text has been thought of as a meditation manual, and it is certainly one of the most sophisticated meditation manuals in the world, but it is more than that. Patanjali views every aspect of living as an opportunity for practicing wisdom. He is concerned with how we think and act, how we breathe, move, sleep, dream, and speak. Every aspect of our motivation, cognition, and behavior is of interest to Patanjali, and he harnesses them all as part of the path of yoga. Patanjali's treatise comes with a notorious challenge. The Yoga Sutra was clearly written for advanced practitioners. As a result, many of us contemporary yogis, who have not yet experienced the dazzling possibilities described in the Yoga Sutra, find it difficult to read, its meanings often frustratingly elusive. This has been a problem for me and for many of my friends who practice yoga and who wish to understand its deeper practices. My first copy of the Yoga Sutra sat for almost 5 years on my bedside table gathering dust. Occasionally it called out to me just before sleep, reminding me of my obligations as a yoga student. Read me. Because I am a Presbyterian by upbringing, I guess, and an overachiever by nature, this eventually worked. I picked it up. I'm glad I did. For a decade and a half now, I've been pondering small and digestible portions of the Yoga Sutra. It's been challenging at times, but compelling, because a little bit of study reveals a stunningly clear exposition of the structure of human consciousness and the path of optimal living. Early students of the Yoga Sutra have made extravagant claims about studying the Yoga Sutra. One tradition, about which I remain skeptical, claims that the internal architecture of this treatise is in itself so mind-altering that simply memorizing and repeatedly chanting its lines will lead to complete liberation. There is reassuring news about the challenges of this treatise. We contemporary yogis are not alone with its difficulties as we might imagine. For 2,000 years, this complex document has intrigued, inspired, and befuddled practitioners of yoga. As a result, it has spawned countless translations, commentaries, and verbal and written wrestling matches of every sort. Each new generation of yoga practitioners struggles with this treatise and leaves behind the helpful traces of that struggle. It seems certain that most of Patanjali's students and peers were renunciates and ascetics who devoted their lives to rigorous training, like Olympic athletes of the spirit. They were willing and able to invest the tens of thousands of hours usually required to master the forms of mental training detailed in the Yoga Sutra. Patanjali was clearly writing for these yogi athletes. Much of what he writes presumes a direct experience of the various stages of yoga which he describes. Alas, most of us contemporary Western yogis are not ascetics, or monks, or nuns, and though we may aspire to be Olympic athletes of the spirit, most of us do not have so much time on our hands. We're lucky to practice for half an hour a day, between getting meals for the kids, doing the laundry, and working the extra shifts to pay for the new roof. Does it make any sense, then, for us to study this ancient wisdom tradition of yoga? Perhaps we should just stick with our once or twice weekly dose of downward-facing dog pose and cobra pose at the YMCA. Does it make any sense for us to meddle in a tradition originally prescribed for wandering renunciates and mystics? I think it does. For when we pare Patanjali's treatise down to its bare bones, we will find that at its heart lies some very simple principles and practices virtually anyone can understand and use. Indeed, in many cases, they are principles and practices we can use while we're getting meals for the kids and doing the laundry and getting to work. They are principles and practices we can use in conjunction with our twice-a-week yoga classes or our daily practice of Ashtanga yoga or Kripalu, Iyengar, or Bikram yoga. And it is my experience that we can discover a great deal of freedom in the process. To be honest, though, this freedom will almost certainly not include extinguishment of all the roots of suffering, achieved by the great yogi athletes of ancient India. It will almost certainly not include the fantastic supernormal powers of which Patanjali writes in his great treatise, but it might, just might, include liberation of a sort nonetheless. For the last 15 years, I've been studying and teaching the principles of the Yoga Sutra. Throughout most of that time, I have been a teacher at Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health in the Berkshire Hills of Western Massachusetts, the largest residential yoga center in America. I've taught these principles and practices to every sort and condition of modern yogi, sometimes with results that surprise even the most skeptical among us. I am a psychotherapist by training, and schooled in Sigmund Freud's ironic declaration of the goals of Western-style psychotherapy. Psychoanalysis, said Freud, frees the patient from neurotic misery so that he can return to ordinary unhappiness. The ancient yoga practitioners were not nearly so interested in neurotic misery as we have been, but they were very interested in what we might call ordinary unhappiness. Yogis believed there might actually be an antidote for ordinary suffering. My experience with thousands of students over the past 15 years, and in my own life, leads me to believe that this is not esoteric hyperbole. Regular study and practice of the principles of yoga does in most cases lead to a life with less suffering. It does free us to live more fully. In some cases, and I've seen more than one, it even leads to profound changes in character. In the chapters that follow, I'll attempt to bring to life the bare bones of this fascinating tradition of Raja Yoga, as they are laid out in the Yoga Sutra, as they are embodied in the lives of my friends, students, fellow yogis, and teachers on the path. As our story unfolds, the listener will meet 6 contemporary yogis who have given the broader principles of Patanjali a serious try. Jake O'Brien, a lawyer struggling at midlife with seemingly intractable relationship issues. Maggie Winslow, a 62-year-old aspiring novelist seeking to discover her own authentic voice. Susan Goldstein, a popular interior designer, wife and mother who suffers from compulsive eating. Kate Johansson, a professional dancer now retired because of injury and separated from her wealthy husband. Rudy Sawyer, a local Berkshire's handyman, gardener, and yoga adept. And myself, a middle-aged, sometimes neurotic, and possibly overeducated wasp, trying to have a useful and happy life, and struggling to write a book very much like this one. My narrative unfolds at or near Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health in Lenox, Massachusetts. The characters are composite portraits based on real people, and all the stories in this book reflect real events. However, names, dates, and circumstances have been significantly altered to honor the obligations of friendship, confidentiality, and decency. It will become apparent to the listener that each character in this book struggles with some particular aspect of living. It is not fashionable in so-called spiritual circles these days to talk of struggle. But the ancient yogis did not hesitate to acknowledge that life is full of struggle and pain. And yet, these early practitioners found that struggle itself could be transmuted into the most noble characteristics of the human being. Indeed, an optimal life is not possible without struggle. Liberation and struggle are two sides of the same coin. Occasionally in this book, the words of an intriguing character will appear, a character who was particularly interested in struggle and its relationship to liberation. His name was Swami Kripalu, 1913 to 1981. He was the most recent lineage holder of an ancient yoga lineage that stretches back to mythic Indian time, back to Vishvamitra, an Indian seer who was one of the founders of Vedic Hinduism. Kripalu Center is named for Swami Kripalu, who visited and lived with the community for 4 years before his death in 1981. Swami Kripalu was a highly accomplished Hatha yogi. He was also a devoted adherent of the larger wisdom tradition of Raja Yoga. He was a prolific writer, poet, classical musician, athlete, actor, and speaker. He was dauntingly learned. At the same time, he was a sweet and down-to-earth man, very grandfatherly. He also had a warrior side, and was relentlessly honest about the reality of struggle. He said, "In the entire world, there is not one human being who is free from pain. Even in favorable conditions, a person encounters struggle. The external form of struggle appears to be cruel. Some describe it as a horrible demon, but its nature is not malicious. In fact, it is proper to welcome struggle, for its arrival is always auspicious. Struggle keeps us from growing sluggish. It changes an animal into an ideal person. It transforms an ordinary human into a spiritually awake person respected by the world. It is all right if we cannot receive struggle with love, but struggle should never be discarded. To discard struggle is to discard God's grace." Struggle and liberation live side by side in the life of a practitioner of yoga. My hope is that the stories of struggle and liberation that follow will inspire the listener to look carefully into the possibilities of transmuting ordinary struggle into a quietly extraordinary life, and that our gaze backward into the discoveries of the ancient yogis will also be a gaze inward, a gaze that will, as Eliade suggests, unlock our own authentic possibilities for living. Lenox, Massachusetts, 2005. Prologue. Seekers Then and Now. Seek not to follow in the footsteps of the wise ones of old. Seek what they sought. Adapted from Matsuo Basho, 1644 to 1694. Contemporary seekers mildly neurotic. I sat at the highest point of the old orchard with my back leaning against the gnarly bark of an apple tree. The massive brick structure at Kripalu Center lay 100 yards below, down a steep hill now covered with August wildflowers. In the distance, the Berkshire Hills receded into the late summer morning, in waves of green and distant purple. The lawn crews had been at work again the afternoon before, and the sweet smell of newly mown grass mixed with the cool morning air. I let my whole weight drop back against the tree. Shortly, Maggie and Jake would join me for a hike to the ridge, where we would meet Kate and our friends Rudy and Susan for a picnic. I had arrived early at our meeting place in the orchard, hoping for a quiet moment to myself. I was feeling cranky, on edge. This day marked the end of a 6-month writing sabbatical. Tomorrow I would go back to work full-time, teaching yoga. For the previous 6 months I had been working on a beginner's guide to Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. This morning I felt defeated. In 6 months I had barely scratched the surface of this complex treatise. For much of the sabbatical I'd found myself caught up in reading various commentaries and translations, both ancient and modern. My desk was stacked with yellowing esoteric scriptures and books on Sanskrit. If anything, I was more confused about the ancient path than when I began. Recently, I had considered giving up the project altogether. Certainly the world did not need another amateur examination of Patanjali. But something about this scripture, this tradition, had snagged me, lodged itself under my skin. Part of me wished that it had left me alone, but there was something here for me, though I wasn't yet even sure what it was. I sensed that my gropings around this enigmatic tradition had already changed the way I looked at the world. I let out a sigh, and I rested in the shade of the tree. There was probably no way out of the task I had set for myself. I had a contract with a publisher, and my editor Robert was expecting a completed manuscript in about a year. I supposed I would have to plow ahead with the manuscript, poking away at it in what little spare time I had. For a moment my eye caught a hawk circling overhead. The late August sky was crystal blue, more like the high blue sky of a July day, but the air was dry and cool. Just a hint of color was already appearing in the trees, and there was in the air the kind of whiff of autumn that so delighted our New England poet-philosopher Henry David Thoreau. It was utterly still in the orchard, and for a few delightful moments I was absorbed in the quiet. My reverie was interrupted by the early approach of Maggie Winslow, who perhaps had also anticipated a moment alone. I raised my head and watched as she crossed the last stretch of lawn to join me. As always, Maggie carried herself with a kind of natural elegance. She was 62 years old this month. Maggie had inherited the best of her high wasp family genes. She was tall, almost stately. I'm sure that her regular yoga practice over the last 12 years had contributed to the lithe quality of her movements. The many tweedy skeptics among her friends in Lenox would say it was rather a lifetime of tennis and swimming that had lent her movements such grace. Her face was long and distinguished. Her high cheekbones, which could have been severe on another face, were softened by large brown eyes. Her hair was cut, and had been for the last 45 years, in what used to be called a page boy. Simple and somewhat severe, but perfectly Maggie. Maggie sat down on the grass next to me. She said nothing, but reached out for my hand and held it as she looked at me, then kissed the back of it. Her white skin had the sweet smell of lavender soap. We had become immediate friends when I bought the little cottage next to her family's collapsing Tudor manse. The houses, just 2 miles down the road from where we now sat, were positioned such that I could see directly through my kitchen window into hers. She had invited me to tea the week after I moved in, and before long I was a regular visitor. Most days during the summer I would wander over for tea or to help her in her herb and flower garden. "Well, my dear, I will miss you terribly," said Maggie with a sigh. And I would miss her. Throughout the 6 months of my sabbatical, Maggie, too, had been holed up with a writing project. Maggie was writing a novel. When asked, Maggie described herself as an invisible writer, and I suppose in some sense this was true. She was certainly invisible to the world of New York publishing houses. She had 3 unpublished novels on her shelf now, and was writing another that would most likely never see a publisher's list. Maggie and I had developed a joint routine. We would both study and or write in the early hours of the morning, then break at 10:30. I would go to her house for tea, either in her big timbered parlor or in the garden, and then we would take a walk up to the orchard where we now sat. Sometimes we would walk all the way to the ridge, a mile up the winding path through the woods behind us. We both did our yoga postures in the afternoon, between 4 and 6, and sometimes meditated together for half an hour after that. We sat together now for a moment in silence. Finally, Maggie lifted her chin. "Well, come on. At least now you can get your head out of those old books and rejoin the world of real people." I looked at her sideways. There was truth in what she said. But I knew that Maggie felt as driven by the writing life as I did, and she must have known that it was more complicated than that. Maggie and I both heard Jake arrive before we actually saw him. We turned our heads. "Run, Cope!" Jake had thrown a frisbee, and it was now soaring out over the young trees at the front of the orchard. Frisbee had become our favorite game throughout this short but unusually warm Berkshire summer. I stumbled to my feet and raced to catch it, but missed by a body length. Jake O'Brien appeared over the crest of the hill, having entered the orchard from a different direction than Maggie. He was smiling broadly and wearing his usual 3-day growth of beard. Jake was a lawyer from Boston, who had become a fixture in our world earlier that summer. He was tall and lean, with a long face and high brow, and a thick mane of red-brown hair. Jake approached us and hugged Maggie, practically picking her up off her feet. Maggie resisted, outwardly, but clearly loved the attentions of this handsome younger man. Jake pulled a small figure out of his knapsack. "And this is for you, Miss Maggie, as a corrective for your stuffed shirt pilgrim ancestors." Jake had brought Maggie a small bronze statue of the dancing Shiva, or Shiva Nataraja, the yogi's god of transformation. He placed it carefully on the edge of the big wicker picnic basket that Maggie had carried up to the orchard. Maggie feigned horror. What would her devout Episcopalian ancestors think? Shiva sat happily on the brown wicker basket, dancing in his bronze ring of fire. Jake had been passing out these little statues for the past month, sharing the bounty from a box of them he'd found at a flea market in Manhattan. After some catching up, we pulled together our gear for the picnic and headed up the narrow path behind the orchard single file, bound for the ridge at the top of the mountain, where we would meet our friends and spend the day hiking, exploring, and eating. The day would celebrate the end of my sabbatical and the end of the remarkable summer we had shared. I brought up the rear, carrying the picnic basket full of sandwiches. Jake bounded ahead of me. He was tanned from a summer of camping and cycling, and he looked wiry and healthy. It was hard to imagine that this was the same guy who had arrived so bewildered and depressed at my door just 4 months before, after messing up badly, his words, at his white shoe Boston law firm. In retrospect, it was clear that Jake's summer break from the law and from the city had turned out to be an excellent idea. As we made our way up the sun-spotted path, I thought of our yogi forebears in the forests and mountains of ancient India. I thought of the great teacher Patanjali and the students he must have gathered around him. I wondered, were these early yogis really any different from us? Were they as conflicted, as neurotic, as ordinary? Was their seeking, in fact, very much like ours? Did they also lurch and stumble from one discovery to another? Or were they some other strain of human being altogether? The spirit of the strivers. The wisdom of classical yoga has its roots in the social and spiritual crucible of what is now India, during the 6th, 5th, and 4th centuries BCE. During these centuries, the traditional social and religious hierarchies of parts of the Indian subcontinent were being transformed. Village structures were challenged by the increasing social and...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?